Network. I am thrilled to be joined today with Brandon Hoff. Thanks for being here, Brandon.
Hey, happy to be here. Thank you.
So, a little background about Brandon. He's a socio-technologist and a cooperative economics founder. I want to dig into that, what exactly that means in a moment. He built a multimillion-dollar equity-focused supply chain co-op and then launched RUDI, RUDI, an AI studio and public education initiative that explores how generative systems reshape everyday life. With thousands of hours in GPT-powered practice, Brandon trains leaders on AI social impact, and his work has been featured by NPR, MSNBC, and other major outlets. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom and experience, with our audience today.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Timely discussions, and more of these discussions need to happen. So I'm happy.
Yeah. So Brandon and I met at the Call to Culture conference. It was more than a conference.
Right.
It was like a space, a curated space for like authentic conversations and insights about, I mean, how did you end up at that conference? Because you're very unique. I usually interview like HR people or DEI people, and so you're like 100% all in AI. And so
Right.
what brought you to that conference? Because there were a lot of DEI practitioners there, like myself.
Right. So I think the cooperative piece. So I founded a cooperative years back, and part of it was devoted to just worker rights, worker innovation, exploring more inclusive economic models. How do we start to wane ourselves off of capitalistic principles? What would they
Mm,
look like? And what would it look like in a way that is not charity, but self-sustainable, self-efficacy? Like how would it look? And so I went on this
yeah.
journey in a case study in trying to build a worker-owned cooperative. And so without going too deep into worker-owned cooperative, it's worker-centered. And I think that's the crossover for Call to Encourage being centered around workplace culture. And so Angela and I, who founded it, her and I talked about just what that would look like from a intersection between technology and workplace organizational leadership, work
Mhm.
culture, and how do these things all fit together. And so I walked away, really feeling refreshed. It was really good to just be in the orbit of people who care about this kind of work.
Mhm.
I think that all workers, because we are for the most part all workers, and so this work is really good for everyone, really, to understand, how do we punch up and how do we start to have more power as workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was really glad to meet you there. I do want to, I made an interesting connection as I was about to jump on the call with you today, which is I usually don't rock my bald head. Like, I don't. Like, I have
Okay.
pictures of it. Like I've only been bald as of like October of last year, so it's a newer experience for me. I usually wear head wraps. I'll wear wigs on these calls pretty often, and I'm always like changing the wig. So if you look at the videos, I'm like in a different wig each week.
Uh-huh.
But I was feeling the ball today. I was feeling it, so I was like, I'm just gonna rock the ball today. I even put like in our thumbnail for the YouTube video like a bald picture of me. But then I
Wonderful.
realized right before we jumped on, I was like, I was bald at that conference. I felt so safe and like my authentic self was going to be embraced, and I didn't have to like wear any masks or literally wear a mask over my bald head, even that's what it is. And it was just so refreshing and liberating. And I was like, oh, and Brandon was there too. Like, you see me more bald than anything.
Only way I've ever experienced you, so I'm happy that you came in your original authentic self.
Well, enough about that. I want to get into first and foremost, what does it mean to be both a socio-technologist and a cooperative economics founder? What do those mean?
Yeah. So technology. So a lot of times I talk with people and I'm like, man, I'm not a computer scientist. I don't really identify
Yeah.
as a computer scientist. I haven't been classically trained in computer science. So oftentimes when I look at and evaluate technologies, it's not usually through the speed and veracity of like what the technology can do. Although I think it's impressive, but I tend to evaluate the effects of this technology through how it's going to impact our society. And so I really sit at that, intersection between technology and social impact, and how can we use technology to make our lives better. And so I'm
Yeah.
looking for ways to be able to do that. And then a part of that is the cooperative economics extends to, we all have to have sustenance and we all have to exist within our society. We have to find our way through it. And economic mobility, economic efficiency is typically the way in which we all do it. And so I look for ways and spaces to which we can do that in the spirit of togetherness. How can we start to work um, outside of these classical economic models through technology? And so this
Yeah.
is where it all kind of intersects for me.
Because there's plenty of institutions and organizations that are working for social justice, they're working for social impact, they're working to make the world a better place, but they're usually like slow old nonprofits that are
Right.
dependent on grants, and technology, as you just said, it can exponentially like enhance outcomes, right? So why not be applying it towards the big problems that matter, rather than it being gate kept by capitalists and people just trying to make money.
Right. And so that's the biggest. So that's been the last 3 years, has been me trying to understand how these now that generative AI is the new craze, how is it going to impact? How can we use it in a way that's impactful? What does it look like for us as workers to make things square? Is there a way to become wholer in this? If there is, let's uncover it. And so, I try to approach it at least from that lens to find where those opportunities could be.
Yeah. Well, it's very cool, I have to say. It's such a good application of the tools we have available and trying to make the world a better place. So human-centered AI, like what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Like, is it possible? Because right now the narrative is largely AI is taking over. It's going to take over our jobs. Like what's your take on human-centered AI?
Yeah, it's unfortunate the way we are marketing or even embracing the tool, because you're right. Like most of the discussion is about AI. Somebody's using AI is going to take your job, um, and there's some merit and some truth. I won't be full 100% tech optimist, but I do think that human centered. I've been at least doing work around like how to approach human centered. I think that it's bifurcated into two spaces. You have your, from a macro level, like really high, how is it going to affect us in society? How is it going to affect us in work? And then there's a really micro, how is it going to affect me personally and how am I going to use it? Right. And so there's two different ways. And so I think from specifically a workplace, because that's who's using it the most, right? They're investing the most money in it right now.
Mhm.
Enterprise and corporate are at least bearing the cost risk for this whole experiment. And so in the workplace, I think human centered has to be more than just humans in the loop, just saying
Yeah.
humans are aware of it. There has to be an investment and concerted effort into training and worker development. Like there has to be, if productivity gains are going to be increased, if that's the whole purpose of being able to pursue this tool is to increase productivity, then there has to be a conversation in how those productivity gains enhance the worker directly, that benefits the worker. And so I think it starts there, from worker equity and what that looks like in a world where machines are going to be doing more work that would normally require humans. And so I think corporations and workers alike should be having discussions around what that looks like. I think
Mhm.
companies honest in terms of what their goals and implementation processes will be for generative systems or artificial intelligence, to have those, to socialize that, because there's a lot of anxiety
Yeah.
and that exists within the workplace. And so how do you start to have these dialogues around when it's appropriate to use artificial intelligence? Who has what security protocols is this? What
Mhm.
information can be shared? how do I actually use this? And so companies
Yeah.
need to invest in the literacy. And I think that that's at its biggest focus point for companies in particular, for what human-centered looks like.
And then, so you said like you bifurcate it. It's like macro and micro. So like, can you dig a little bit more into what you mean by the micro part?
And so micro is just like on my personal. And so we're going to need advocacy on a lot of different frontiers. A lot of times I have this conversation, and people, what about, there's a lot of what about climate? What about accessibility? What about literacy? What about and so I usually say, like, yeah, all these things are relevant. All these things are very, very, very important. And we are going to need advocacy across these channels. And part of the way to do that is to understand how the tools are working, understand how they're impacting your orbit. And I think there's a responsibility that exists on a very personal level to learn, to say, okay, how is this tool going to impact the spaces that I'm in, and to be knowledgeable about that so that you can go to the school board and vote on what that looks like. When there are candidates who are talking about plans on artificial intelligence and legacy, like how do you anticipate voting? And so knowing, what that looks like, I think on a very personal level, is how you can encourage the ecosystem of human-centered.
So, do you have any examples of what human-centered AI looks like in action?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I'm actually working right now with a couple school districts, K through 12 school districts.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we're talking about is accessibility, especially for students who have learning challenges.
Yeah.
And right now, there's a major opportunity in being able to create learning programs, customized learning plans that are catered to individual students, and so the students who may have a wide variety of challenges when it comes to learning, but being able to build systems and environments that help create multimodal forms of learning, that create kinesthetic, that allow different inputs, that allow conversational learning. I think that having an openness to what accessibility looks like for those who learn different, I think is one of the ways that we incorporate human-centered applications.
So, accessibility is a big one. Um, what about the whole, like, thinking at the micro level?
Mm-hmm.
If AI is becoming intelligent to like largely replace a lot of jobs, I always hear the counter argument to that, but then different jobs will be made. Like it will be but I also see it being a numbers game. And so I wonder, especially from a social, justice, social impact perspective, is UBI, universal basic income, part of that conversation as well? Like AI is going to get us to a point where we're not going to need to work as much as a society. How are people gonna eat?
Yeah, I think this is my fear, right? So adoption is really going to be the bottleneck for any of the artificial intelligence systems. And that part of it is that generative AI is the focus that we have, and it needs operators. It needs people that know how to use the tool versus traditional AI systems that, if it's this, then do this. And so it's a
Yeah.
little, so there will be new opportunities created downstream for people who know how to use the tools, right? The question becomes, well, what if I don't know how to use the tool, right? And
Yeah.
then so there's a couple numbers that I follow. One of them is the teen participation rate in the workforce, which has been declining drastically for the last 20 years. Since I've entered the workforce, it's probably down, 30%. And so that's something I look at, teens. And then also I look at the jobs created, layoff announcement rates, and then the unemployment rate. And so I think looking at the unemployment rate and where it's at, we're probably at about 4.5%. But the biggest fear I have is that an increase in to 6% unemployment is drastic, for a lot of especially marginalized communities. And so human center is going to have to be on, a micro level is, training. We're going to have to, our governments are going to have to be a part of this, right? Our school board, this is an entire ecosystem of introduction around artificial intelligence. And so I don't think that the effects are going to be immediate with massive job layoff, right? It's going to be kind of in your entry level positions. We'll see less students entering the workforce. And so your question about UBI, we are absolutely going to need something creative that subsidizes the workforce. And so I got some creative ideas out there. I know UBI is something that is a hot button that doesn't really have, our politicians don't tend to respond well to UBI, but we're going to have something creative around the productivity gains that are made from AI. And so I've been writing about just different tax structures, different tax incentives that allow this to flow back to the worker. But all of this is something that we should be abreast of to be able to put pressure on our governmental officials to be able to do it, to put pressure on corporate to come up with creative solutions to work displacement, because it's a real reality.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, thinking about how a lot of our audience is HR and DEI people, people working internally at organizations or externally as consultants as well, what would be like 3 recommendations you would give to that population about how to just adopt or work with EI in a way that's more human centered?
I think that one of the biggest pieces, man, it's since they're language models and working inside of an organization, it's going to be very important to understand the language of getting things done in organizations. And that's going to spawn out into a lot of different ways. How are people communicating? A big thing now is conversations being recorded in the workplace. How are people responding to being recorded in the workplace? Or what can be uncovered in the data that exists in our conversation? Are people comfortable with this? Do people say what they really mean? Are you going to be training your language models on passive aggressiveness and microaggressions that exist in the language of your organization? When you start to think about communicating and talking with language models, there's a major, major, major opportunity to work on what is the culture of our organization, because the agents or artificial intelligence or generative systems that get created are just going to mimic the culture that exists within the organization. And so there's a big focus point on how do we work on the culture and language of getting things done in our organization. That's a big focus point, I think, for DEI, organizational leaders, HR folks, to lead with this, to say, hey, this is not a tech tool. This is a language tool. And so that's one. And then the second piece is then, looking at this as a change management strategy when talking about it, to say that the only gains that you get with this tool are really how prepared your people are to use it. It's not as simple as just giving ChatGPT and then they're an expert, right? Yeah. That's not how this works. The real investment is going to be in ensuring that the folks in your organization are comfortable and they know how to use it, and they have governance around it. And then this is not going to come from IT. The computer scientists have no clue how to legislate this. And so we are going to absolutely need the voices that exist within DEI. So I don't want folks in DEI to be discouraged, especially if now we start to talk about dismantling DEI. I think that if you look at it from the tech lens, from language, you'll say you absolutely need equity, inclusiveness, and diversity when we start talking about how you deploy agents in your organization. You need even down on it. And so that's going to be very important. And I think the last one is, there has to be a level of hopefulness that happens, to be hopeful that, we can figure this out, that the work is still important to do. There are spaces to still be able to do this kind of work as it, tech oligarchs start to yield their power, right? So being hopeful and just finding that and leveraging other folks, being community centered, having these kind of discussions, talking about it, being resources. I make myself a resources for many people to be able to just offer, insights and dialogue around which direction to go. And so those will probably be the main things top of mind for me.
I love that. I love that. Brandon, for those who want to work with you or learn more about you or get in touch, how would you recommend them reaching out?
Sure, I'm pretty active on TikTok. We talk a lot about Hoff Digital. We talk a lot about AI ethics and responsible use of digital intelligence. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about artificial intelligence and LinkedIn. So those are the primary spaces. I'm really active on social. Brandon Z Hoff. If you look up that, you'll be able to see all my social channels.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom about AI, how we can make it more human centered. The show's called Better Humans at Work, and so the fact that we can use AI to achieve that goal, I think, is really powerful and exciting. And as you said, like, let's be hopeful and optimistic about it and try to use it for good and not evil.
Absolutely, absolutely.